Welcome to Church of the Rock from Winnipeg. Stay tuned to this week's thought-provoking message from Pastor Mark Hughes.
Well, welcome, church. Today I'm starting a brand new message called Faith the Facts. That's right, Faith the Facts. But what we're going to be doing is we're going to be talking about this thing called faith. And so come on along with that journey. Now, you know what? Here's what happened in the 3rd century. There was a Jewish rabbi. He said something really interesting. He made this observation that in the Old Testament, we have Moses who came out with 613 laws. And then David came along in the Psalms, and he boiled it down to 11 commands. And then we had Isaiah come along, and he made it 6 precepts. And then Micah came along, and he said this, you'll all remember this. He said, "What does the Lord require of you? To do justly, love mercy, and to walk humbly with your God." And then Habakkuk comes along, and he comes and says, "Hey, here's the thing, the just shall live by faith." He boiled it down to one little thing, that the just shall live by faith. And Paul in the New Testament, who does he do all the quoting? He quotes Habakkuk 4 times. He says the just shall live by faith. Because everything we do, how we relate to this invisible God, is we do it through faith. How are we saved? It says, by grace you are saved through faith. Everything we do, everything we relate, every way we get something and receive something from God has to be through this thing called faith. It is the principle in which we live. And every insurmountable problem that we face, we'll get through it and overcome that problem with this thing called faith. So we're going to talk a lot about what faith is, but I'm going to take a moment and talk about what faith isn't. I'll tell you what faith isn't. Faith is not denying the facts. It's not looking at things and denying that there's a problem and denying that we should have struggles in life. We will have struggles in life. And it was Mary Baker Eddy, and she was the one in 1879, she came up with this new religion, I guess I'll call it that, called Christian Science. Most of you have heard of it. And what she claimed is that the only reality that existed was the spiritual world. And the material world didn't actually exist at all. And what she claimed was this, that any sickness and any evil and any death was just an illusion. And so if you wanted to be healed, you didn't pray for healing. What you did was denied the existence of sickness. Well, of course, that's totally ridiculous. The only things I have problems with Christian Science is, number 1, that's not Christian. Number 2, that's not science. Other than that, it's perfect. So what we're going to do today is we're going to talk about 2 stories, both from the Gospel of Mark, one in Mark chapter 4, the other one in Mark chapter 6. Both of them are about the same thing, and they're about the storms of life. So the first story, as we find it in Mark chapter 4, is this. So Jesus has his disciples. He tells them to get into the boat, and when he gets them into the boat, he says, "Let us cross over to the other side." Now, I don't want you to miss that. He didn't say, "Let's go out in the middle of the sea and drown." He said, "Let's go to the other side." So they actually are already working from the basis of a promise. Now here's what's interesting. Jesus didn't pilot the boat. He was a carpenter, not a fisherman, so he left that part to them, and he just went and curled up in the stern of the boat and had a little nap. Now I know all about that because we were on the Sea of Galilee a few years ago, and they were showing us how to fish off the boat, and there was the man, here's a picture of it, and he was throwing the fishing net into the Sea of Galilee. Well, I got bored, and I just went and curled up in the bow of the boat and had a little nap there. I can sleep anywhere. And I just thought, I'm so much like Jesus, really. It's hard to believe. But nevertheless, here's what I want to tell you what happens next. So they go into the middle of the sea, and this huge storm rises up, so much so that the water's coming into the boat. And obviously, the disciples were very afraid because they cried out to Jesus, "Do you not care that we are perishing?" They woke the man up. He was trying to have a nap. And they wake him up. "Do you not care that we are perishing?" Now here's my question. If they woke him up with those words, "Do you not care that we are perishing?" the facts were they were probably perishing. I mean, these were fishermen. They were on this sea every single day. They knew what a storm looked like. And of course, big storms come up there because of the topography, the hills going up on either side. They say that you can have storms on the Sea of Galilee that are like the middle of the ocean. And so I think they were facing reality. You know, it's sort of interesting if you notice the intro and the artwork behind me here. That's actually a picture of Rembrandt's The Storm on the Sea of Galilee. And I'm going to throw it up on the screen for you. Here it is. It's a very famous, probably one of the most famous Rembrandts of all history. And it's actually a picture of what that would have looked like. And I love it so much because you can see just how tempestuous this storm is. It's a dangerous and a horrible storm, and that's probably what it would have looked like, something that they thought that their life was in grave danger. And what's fascinating about this picture, if you zoom in a little bit, you'll see that there are not 13 people, 12 disciples, and Jesus on board. There's actually, if you count them, there's 14 people on that boat. And the reason was because Rembrandt, you ready for this? Rembrandt painted himself into the picture as one of them, and he's the one who went and woke Jesus up. I just think that's hilarious, but I don't want you to miss the point. He saw himself in the narrative. He saw himself in the midst of the storm with the disciples. And I think when we read this story, we need to do the same thing. We need to see ourselves in the midst of the storm because we are going to encounter storms in life. Just one more little bit of history about this. This painting actually has been nowhere seen for 30 years. In 1990, it was in a museum in Boston. Some thieves broke in and they stole a bunch of priceless works, one of them this picture, and they stole it right out of the frame, and it's been gone for 30 years. No one's seen it. And this empty frame still hangs there to this day. To me, I call that faith because they're expecting this painting to come back someday. So I think that's a picture of faith in itself, and I hope it does come back. But nevertheless, it might be one of the most valuable paintings in all of history because of this storied, example and narrative of this painting. But the part I don't want you to miss is this. So Jesus leads them out into this storm, and you think, well, did it catch Jesus off guard? Did he know that they were going to encounter this storm? No, he didn't just know it. He led them out there. The intent was to get to the other side, but Jesus knew there was going to be a storm. This was a test. It was a test of their faith. And the big question is this: did they pass or did they fail? And the answer to that question is they failed. They said, do you not care that we are perishing? They expected that they were going down. Jesus stands up and he says, why is it that you have no faith? And he says, peace, be still. And the winds and the waves went calm. And they turned to him rather and said, what manner of man is this that even the winds and the waves obey? You see, they failed this test. They didn't realize that here's the simple basis of this faith, and I don't want you to miss it. When you faith the facts, not just face the facts, faith the facts, you look at in the face of a storm and you apply your faith to it. And Jesus didn't expect them to calm the storm. That's not what this story's about. It's about the fact that Jesus was right there in the boat with them, and they failed to have faith in that fact that he could deal with it. And so when we look at the storms of life, faith is not being able to solve every problem on your own. It's the opposite. It's believing that God is in the boat, in the midst of the storm with you, and that whatever the situation is that you're encountering, he is able to get you through that storm. You know, I think of this situation we're in right now with the coronavirus. And I mean, we are in a storm. We're in a test. The big question is, are you going to pass? And I'll tell you something. I'll just be honest. I did not see this coming. I did not. You know, on New Year's Day, I remember thinking on New Year's Day what the year was going to be like. You know what I did New Year's Day? I booked my March ski trip and paid for it. I was not expecting something else. I was expecting to go skiing in March, which I did not. But on that same day, I had a thought about the year. And I started thinking about how 33 years ago when I planted Church of the Rock, how I had to believe everything by faith. Everything was by faith. We had no building. We had no people. We had no money. We had no organization. And every single thing we did, I had to trust God for that. And I had to believe God for that. And 33 years later, New Year's Day, I'm looking at my life and I'm realizing how I have so many resources around me. We have this huge building, maybe the biggest church building in all of Canada. We've got this huge staff. We have money if we need it to do things. And if I had a need, I'd just go out and hire somebody. If we had a technical need, I'll just hire somebody. If we needed some equipment, we'd just go buy it. And I realized, and it's a terrible admission, I'm going to say it, I could do church without Jesus. I didn't really need him because I had so many resources around me. And I felt like the Lord spoke to me on New Year's Day, and he said to me, this year I'm going to cause you to have to once again live by faith. Now, I'll be honest with you, at the time I had no idea what that meant. What would that mean? And then all of a sudden, in a matter of a few days is all it was, the building and the staff, I mean, half of them got laid off, unfortunately, and the people, no congregation coming to church, and the money was a big question mark. All of a sudden, I was right back in that place where I was living by faith, and I had to make a decision. Was I going to pass this test or fail this test? You have to make a decision. Are you going to pass this test or are you going to fail this test? And the way we do that is not believe. See, faith isn't this. Faith isn't believing that every problem you have will be resolved just the way you want it to be. That's not faith. That is not the case. You can't expect God to move just like you want him to move. That means you're God, not him. No, faith is believing that God will be with you in the boat, in the midst of the storm, no matter what you face. Yet at the same time, you have to expect the best. Because if you expect the worst, you will probably get the worst. We need to believe that God will be there in the midst of whatever we are facing. So let's look at the second story. The second story happens a few months later. Again, it's on the Sea of Galilee. It's in Mark chapter 6. Kind of cracks me up because I think Jesus has given them a redo. And so we're back in almost the same situation. We're going to go read it. It's in Mark chapter 6. We're going to start at verse 45, and here's what it says. Immediately made his disciples get into the boat and go before him to the other side. Where are they going? Once again, he's telling them to go to the other side, to Bethsaida, while he sent the multitude away. And when he had sent them away, he departed to a mountain to pray. Now when evening came, the boat was in the middle of the sea, and he was alone on the land. Then he saw them straining at rowing, for the wind was against them. Now about the fourth watch of the night, he came to them walking on the sea, and would have passed them by. And when they saw him walking on the sea, they supposed it was a ghost, cried out, for they all saw him and were troubled. But immediately he talked with them and said to them, be of good cheer, it is I, do not be afraid. Then he went up into the boat to them, and the wind ceased, and they were greatly amazed in themselves beyond measure, and they marveled. So we have almost the same story. Their goal, their mission was to go to the other side of the sea, and he told them to get to the other side. They end up in the middle of the sea. They end up in a huge storm. The only big difference in this story is this time Jesus isn't with them. And he stays back and he sends them up. Why? He wants them to pass this test. I mean, it's one thing to believe that Jesus is with you when you can actually see him in the boat. It's another thing to believe that he is with you when you can't see him, because that's what faith is, right? You have seen, therefore you believe. More blessed are those who have not seen and still believe. So he sends them out for their second test. Lets them get into this storm. And there's three things that happen here. It says, number one, he was watching them from afar, straining and rowing. And number two, it says he finally came to them on the fourth watch of the night. We'll talk about that. And then it said, number three, that he would have passed them by. So I have 3 points I want to make about this. I'm going to throw them up on the screen. Here they are. Number one, Jesus is always watching. Number two, Jesus is never late. Number three, don't let Jesus pass you by. So the first thing is this. When Jesus sent them out, he went off to pray, but he didn't just go and ignore them. He was up on that mountain, and that whole time while he was praying, he was watching them, and he could see them out on that sea, and he could see them bobbing like a cork in those waves and in the midst of that storm. He was watching them, and it says he was watching them strain. And here's the thing I don't want you to miss. He didn't run out and rescue them. I mean, that's what we would want Jesus to do, to come and rescue us in the midst of our struggle, but he didn't. He watched them struggle. And you know why? You say, why would he do that? Why wouldn't Jesus just rescue them? The same way we as a parent don't try to rescue our children every time they do something. We let them go through life straining and struggling. Why? Because they become better and they become stronger and they learn and they grow. And if we don't let them strain a little bit in life, they're never going to learn anything. Those of you that have been around this church long enough will know this story, but I'm going to tell it again. And it's the story of my daughter, Danica. When she was 3 years old, I was at work. She was at home with her mom, Kathy, and she wanted to go roller skating. And our window from our kitchen faced our side driveway. And so Kathy went and put her roller skates on and sent her out the front door and said, "Don't leave the front side driveway there, and I'll watch you out of the window." So Kathy was in the kitchen. She was cooking or doing something and watching her daughter, and she was roller skating there. And then she went and she turned and she went to get something out of the fridge, and she comes back and she's no longer on the driveway. And from that same window, you could see the tree fort that I'd built in the backyard. Now, I built this tree fort in the backyard. It was 6 feet high. And I thought, not only do I need a nice high tree fort, I need a big, huge, long slide. So I built this big, huge, long slide out of a giant piece of plexiglass. And then it went like this, and it shot off like a ski jump at the bottom. Can you imagine? Kathy looks out. Where is she? Where is she? She looks, and there she is going up into the tree fort in her roller skates. She's now standing right on the edge of the slide, ready to go, holding on to the rail like this. She's about to take off. She watches a lot of cartoons. She knows how this works. You can go down anything. You can go down hydro lines if you want. And so there she is in her roller skates. And Kathy, as soon as she saw her up there, she ran to the door, but she said it felt like she was in slow motion, running to the door, trying to get to the door to stop. Got to the door, opened the door, and went, "No!" But by then it was too late, and Danica launched off like she was taking off on a major ski jump. And of course, it didn't work quite as well as it does in the cartoons. Her feet went out from underneath of her. She landed on her back, went down that slide, and launched 6 feet across the yard, landing on the back on her grass. And of course, she was crying and upset and whatever, and Kathy was there literally in moments to pick her up. And the point was this, she didn't hurt herself. That we're grateful for that. But here's the thing. Kathy was always watching. She was there. She couldn't stop her from doing it. She still did it. But nevertheless, that's how you grow, because she never did it again. And what happens, we don't want our kids to hurt themselves. I get that. We don't want them to, inflict damage on themselves. But they probably will. And the thing is, a good parent is always watching, always looking. And the same thing is true with God. He's always looking, and he knows we'll struggle, and he knows we'll strain, and he'll know we'll wrestle against the winds of adversity, just like the disciples were. But as Nietzsche once said, and I'm not a big one to quote Nietzsche, but Friedrich Nietzsche once said this, "Whatever doesn't kill you will only make you stronger." And there's some truth to that. We grow through adversity. We grow through struggle. We grow through straining. There's a picture I love, and maybe you've seen it. It's time-lapse photography of a chick being born out of an egg. And the chick will be in this and outgrow this egg and will be stuck in this little tiny egg. So what it has to do is it has to get out, and it begins to peck at the egg from the inside. And you've probably seen it. It begins to peck, and of course, then the egg begins to open, and finally it cracks in half, and this little chick comes out, this little chick, bucking its head like this and walking like a little chick would, and all like, full of blood and guts and gore. But one of the things I never knew was that if you help that chick get out, if you go and tap that egg and you break it open and you help that chick get out, that chick will die when it comes out. Because it's the coming out of that shell. It's pressing and struggling and straining to get out of that shell is the thing that makes it strong enough to face life outside the shell. And the same thing is true with the adversities and the storms of life. They are the things that make us stronger. But let's not forget this first point, that Jesus is always watching, even when we're straining. So the second part of this story is this, that Jesus is never late. Now, I love it. I mentioned it to you a couple of times. It says, Jesus came to them walking on the water on the fourth watch of the night. Well, when is the fourth watch of the night? Well, I'll tell you, the evening, the night is divided into 4 watches from dusk to dawn. The first one being at dusk, the last one being at dawn. So that means, because we know he sent them out in the evening, that means that he let them stay out all night straining. And he didn't come till right before dawn. Could you imagine how long they'd been out there? They'd been out there over 8 hours, maybe 10 hours, struggling and struggling and struggling. And finally, Jesus came. By then, they would have been worn out. By then, they thought it was game over. By then, they thought it was too late. But it wasn't too late, because Jesus is never late. But he will always pass up the opportunity to be early. And I love this because as you look into Scripture, you see it again and again, that Jesus continually does that. God seems to show up right at the last moment. I mean, we think of the story of Moses, for example. He's leading the children of Israel, or out of Egypt, rather, and he's leading them out, and they end up against the Red Sea, and they got the Red Sea on one side, and they got Pharaoh's army on the other side. And then he divides the Red Sea, and they walk across. But it's not until the army is just about on them. You think that seemed late, or at least late-ish, but it wasn't too late. It was just in time, in the nick of time. Then you look at, the story of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. They're expecting God to deliver them from the fiery furnace, which he does, but not until after they get thrown into the furnace. That seemed really late. And yet it says there was a fourth man with them in the midst of the fiery furnace who looked like the Son of God. And then, of course, the most extreme story is the story of Lazarus. Lazarus, of course, he's dead. He's been dead for 4 days. If that isn't late, well, it's late. And next week I'm going to tell you that story because we can learn a lot from the raising of Lazarus. So here's my point. Is don't expect God to be early. Don't expect him to show up when you want him to show up. Expect him to show up when he wants to show up at just the right time. So let me tell you a little story about this. So when we bought our very first building, the one before this, we bought that first building, and we had made this deal. Everything was coming together. We'd raised some money, not a lot of money, but we had raised $160,000. We had secured a mortgage, but the mortgage, they expected us to raise $260,000. And we got right up to the end. We had 48 hours to close this deal, and we were $100,000 short. Now, let's just be honest about it. There's no way a little church like ours in those days was going to be able to come up with $100,000 in 2 days. There was just no way. We had already talked to everybody. We tapped everybody out. We'd done all the offerings. We'd done all the fundraising. We were 2 days away. So the only thing I could do was I called a prayer meeting. So we gathered this prayer meeting together. I'll never forget it. And we're praying that God will give us faith to believe that this deal will close and we'll be able to get this building. And one of our leaders, his name was Vin, he stood up and he says, "You're praying that one of the bankers will give you a mortgage." He says, "I believe that there's going to be 2 banks give us a mortgage and we'll have to choose between them." The whole time I'm thinking, 2? I don't need 2. I just want 1. That's all I want. Anyway, I didn't know what was going to come of this. The very next day, after that prayer meeting, I get a call from someone who I'd never met. And this man says to me, a businessman, and he says, "My daughter goes to your church, and she tells me you need $100,000. That's what he says. "Would you like me to give you $100,000? Well, I don't know. Let me think about that one. I said, "What?" He says, "I'd be prepared to loan you $100,000. Now, you'd need to give it back. There'd be no interest, but in 3 years, I would want that money back. If I gave you $100,000, would you pay it back in 3 years?" I went, "Okay." And so anyway, he says, "Go down and see my lawyer." So I couldn't believe this. I was not even sure it was really happening. So I went down to the lawyer's office. I'll never forget this. I sat down and I said, "Your client says he's going to give me a check for $100,000. And this lawyer says, "Yes, I got it right here." He says he wants me to give you this check, and he doesn't want a mortgage, and he doesn't want a promissory note. All he wants is your word that you're going to pay him back. Are you going to pay him back? I said, "Yes." It was just like in the movies. I reached out to grab the check, and he pulled it away. And he says, "No, this is very unorthodox. This is not good. He should be asking you for a mortgage, or at very least a promissory note. If I give you this check, will you pay it back?" I said, "Yes, I'll pay it back." And I reached out, and he pulled it away again, a second time. And so anyway, this went on and on. I thought, is this guy going to give me this money or not? He didn't want to give me the money because he thought his client was making a mistake. Finally, he says, "I have no choice but to give you the money." And he gave me this check for $100,000. I took it down to the bank, and when the other bank heard that we had enough money, guess what? We had both banks offer us a mortgage, and we had a choice which bank to go with. It was absolutely astounding to me that God moved so profoundly and so extremely in the midst of our need, unlike what we expected him to do, and yet he did it. By the way, we paid that man back $100,000, not in 3 years, but in 1 year, we had paid him all back because the church grew like crazy. It was so amazing to me how God works. He's never late, but he will never come early either. I don't think he will either. And you know, it's like everything, right, in life. Timing is everything. It's like that old joke, you've probably heard it, about the doctor. He phones his patient and says, I got some good news and bad news. What do you want first? He says, give me the good news. He says, well, the good news is you have cancer and you have 24 hours to live. He says, that's the good news. If that's the good news, what's the bad news? He says, the bad news is I meant to call you yesterday. Timing is everything. So the first thing is this, is that Jesus is always watching. The second thing is that Jesus is never late. And the last and the final thing is this, is that you cannot or don't let Jesus pass you by. And that's what it said here. It says that he finally came, in the fourth watch of the night, he finally shows up walking on the water, and it says he could have passed them by. And I don't know if we ever think about this, but the whole secret to this story was they needed to get Jesus into the boat. And as soon as he got into the boat, the scripture says that the wind and the waves went calm. He didn't say anything, he didn't pray anything. All he had to do was get into that boat, and everything was resolved. But they could have let him walk right by. They could have gone, that looks a lot like Jesus. Does that look like Jesus to you? Or maybe Jesus, or maybe a ghost. I don't know. No, that's not what they did. They got him into the boat. And when they got him into the boat, everything changed. And see, the same thing is true with our lives. We've got to get Jesus into the midst of our situation. And once we do that, once we put ourselves in the midst of it like Rembrandt did in his Storm on the Sea of Galilee, once we put ourselves into that situation and get Jesus into our boat, everything gets resolved. Let me give you one last thought on this, and it's the story of blind Bartimaeus. Here we have blind Bartimaeus. He's a beggar. He's standing by the side of the road or sitting by the side of the road. And because he's blind, he can't tell Jesus is in town, but he can hear him. And he can hear the commotion, and he's heard the stories. And so he stands up and he starts shouting. And he says, Jesus, Son of David, have mercy on me. And it says that the disciples tried to silence him, and he called out even the more, Jesus, Son of David, have mercy on me. Why was he crying out even more? I'll tell you why. He wasn't going to let Jesus pass him by. And the key to seeing our problems resolved, the key to getting peace in the midst of the storm, is to get Jesus into the boat and not let him pass us by. And so many times we're trying to do everything on our own, and we fail to recognize that Jesus wants to get into our boat, wants to get into our life and change everything. So blind Bartimaeus continued to cry out and saying, Jesus, Son of David, have mercy on me. So Jesus goes right up to him and says, what do you want? He said, that I might receive my sight. And Jesus said, go your way. Your faith has made you well. You see, what he did was he used his faith. He applied it to the situation. He knew he was blind. He didn't deny the fact that he was blind. He faced the facts, but more importantly, he faithed the facts. And he applied faith to the situation. And that's how we get God to move. Remembering these simple principles that Jesus is always watching. Jesus is never late. And don't let Jesus pass you by. Whatever situation you are in, get Jesus into your boat. Because our God is greater. Our God is stronger. Our God is higher than any other God. That's how faith works.
If you'd like a booklet to help you understand more about God's gift of forgiveness and reconciliation through Jesus Christ, please contact us, and we'd be happy to send you a free copy of the Book of Hope. Visit our website at www.churchoftherock.ca. Thank you for watching, and God bless you.